Well, good morning, and thank you again for joining us for this 10th episode of the Resilience Advantage. We really appreciate your support, and hopefully, you've had a chance to view some of the past 9 episodes. They're all available on the U.S. Resiliency Council website, usrc.org. Today, we have a really exciting program for you. We're building on our last episode around resilience policy, and we're calling this episode Resilience Policy 2.0. And we get into some more details about specific ways to think about how to implement resilience programs, whether you're a private company or an organization or a public entity. So, the goal of our series, of course, as you know, has been to really bring all the concepts of resilience to the stakeholders in the built environment. Those can be building owners and tenants, advocacy groups, public and private organizations and companies, and decision makers at the local, state, and even federal level. And we're very happy today to have a couple special guests from the state and federal level on our panel. I'd like to start this by introducing a very special guest of ours today, our State Treasurer, Fiona Ma. Fiona Ma is California's 34th State Treasurer, and the Treasurer's Office was created back in 1849, so just before we became a state. It provides the financing for all of the schools, the roads, the housing, recycling, waste management, all of the hospitals and public facilities. Really, all of our crucial infrastructure is financed by the State Treasurer's Office. Fiona Ma is basically our banker, our state banker. Her office processes more than $2 trillion in transactions within a given year. And Treasurer Ma is responsible for providing transparency, oversight for all of the state's investment portfolio, as well as the state's surplus fund. She oversees an investment portfolio of more than $100 billion. And a significant portion of that is associated with the more than 2,200 local governments and agencies in California. So with that, we're really happy to have Treasurer Ma here to give us a few comments and to participate later in the show on our panel. Treasurer Ma?
Great. Thank you, Evan, so much for inviting me to participate. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as you will figure out as we continue with this webinar. I'd like to thank the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, Los Angeles County Business Federation, and the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation for putting on these series of webinars, and especially my good friend Ali Sahabi of Optimum Seismic. He is calling or texting me very often about this very, very important topic. And I have to tell you, we did a little bit of research according to the Southern California Earthquake Data Center by Caltech. I don't know if people actually know how many earthquakes we actually have during a day, during a week here in California. Yesterday, for example, we had 4 measurable earthquakes, a 3.8 in Coalinga, a 2.9 earthquake in Milpitas, a 2.9 in Fontana, and a 2.9 in San Fernando. Now, these are different cities across across California, so it's not only one geographic area, which is kind of shocking. And in the last week, we had over 1,000 earthquakes in California and Nevada, with the majority of them being here in California. So this is super, super important. I know Ali's in Los Angeles. They have 57 earthquakes in Los Angeles area last week. And here in the Bay Area, we had 234 earthquakes in the Bay Area alone. Now, this is this week. And we talk about, the big one, when the big one is going to be coming. So it's not about if, but it is about when. And I had just moved to California back in 1989, at the beginning of 89. And in October, we had the big Loma Prieta earthquake. And that was the first time that I experienced an earthquake. Growing up on the East Coast, we have different types of emergency situations. But here in California, it was very special. And that was the first time I worked in a big I worked on the 34th floor of the Bank of America building. We had the Loma Prieta and everyone was screaming. We had to walk down steps. Everything was in pandemonium. And that really started my passion on earthquake resiliency, prevention, mitigation. And now, as the state treasurer, I sit on the California Earthquake Authority Board. We are a 3-member voting board, and it is me, the head of the California Office of Emergency Services, and the insurance commissioner. And so we are even more committed to making sure we do our part, not only for home insurance, earthquake insurance, but also for mitigation. And it's a very, very popular program that we sponsor at the California Earthquake Authority is the Brace and Bolt program. That started in 2013, really to encourage homeowners living in pre-1980 homes to do seismic retrofits for their home. And we give out $3,000 in grants to reimburse these homeowners, and we've given out 16,000 grants to date. So I'm very happy that we are continuing with this program. We're just waiting for the federal government to give us a little bit more money. And then in October, FEMA is going to give us another $24 million in grants. And these will be supplemental grants to low and moderate income homeowners to encourage them to seismically retrofit their home. So we've got a lot of plans here. And I know the big shakeout is coming October 21st. We had a great press conference last year in Los Angeles. We're going to hope to top that off this year. So stay tuned. But Ali and I and Evan have been brainstorming on how we can even raise the bar even higher. So again, I thank everyone for being here. Thank you all for doing this. And I look forward to participating in the panel.
Thank you so much, Treasurer Ma. I mean, you can tell she's a CPA, right? She comes prepared with all of the numbers. Frankly, I'm very happy that one of our leaders in Sacramento who's taking care of our money has that background. So thank you, Treasurer Ma, but really also thank you for your incredible interest in seismic safety. We'll be talking a little bit more, I think, about the California Earthquake Authority in some of the panel questions. So at this point, I just also, and Fiona, our Treasurer Ma mentioned this, I'd like to thank our major partners. We have been supported in this effort on the Resilience Advantage series by the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the Los Angeles County Business Federation, and Economic Development Corporation. Of course, the U.S. Resiliency Council is proud to be facilitating this Resilience Advantage series. And of course, we certainly couldn't do it without the generous sponsorship of Optimum Seismic, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. But thank you all for your continued support. We'd also like to thank our individual program champions who help to spread the word and promote each of these episodes as they come. And so we hope that if you're a member of one of these organizations, that you will get engaged and view some of the past episodes, or also share these episodes with your colleagues in your organizations. So with that, we're going to jump into our 10th video of Resilience Policy 2.0. Again, the purpose of these videos is to present relevant information and tools to all the stakeholders in the built environment. We recognize that I'm a structural engineer, but we recognize that not everybody's a structural engineer, and not everybody has or really wants all the technical detail. But they want to understand that there are great opportunities, there's great need, but also great opportunities for us to improve the resilience of our state, of our communities, of our businesses. And we hope that that's the kind of message that you get through these videos. So without further ado, I'd like to present our latest video, Resilience Policy 2.0. Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this series, we're exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our community in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and now even pandemic. In this episode, we'll be taking another look at how disaster resilience policies are driving progress in both the public and private sectors, and how the proper policies can motivate building owners and other stakeholders in the built environment towards longer-term thinking that protects both people and property. Over the past 30 years, there's been a slow but steady trend towards local or state ordinances that require older, vulnerable buildings to be seismically retrofitted. Currently, a number of cities in California are at some point in the process of preparing ordinances regarding the seismic retrofit of older apartment buildings and commercial structures. So now let's look more deeply at what it takes for good disaster policy to be developed, supported, and adopted by the public and private sector. We're calling this Disaster Policy 2.0. Let's frame our conversation around the key elements of resilience. We can do this by describing resilience in terms of 10 INs, I-Ns. The first IN, as it is clearly top of mind in our national conversation, is infrastructure. Recently, President Biden spoke about how the effects of Hurricane Ida were a clarion call that we can't ignore about the potential dangers of natural perils. We have to be thinking different about our infrastructure and build back better. Where what we would characterize as Disaster Policy 1.0 was essentially following the code, ensuring that our buildings provide life safety, Disaster Policy 2.0 would draw on all the lessons we've learned from earthquakes and perils we've experienced in the past, and address the limitations to recovery that existing codes don't address. The second IN goes hand in hand with the first. It's interdependence. Interdependence is a fact of life in modern society. We're all impacted by and depend on others. A disaster in one community or area can easily disrupt life in another. Economic impacts in one sector of our society affect the others. Ryan Kirsting is a licensed California structural engineer who works with Buehler Engineering in Sacramento. He's also the co-chair of the Policy Committee for the Structural Engineers Association of California, or SEAC. The SEAC Policy Committee focuses on legislative activities in California relating not just to the practice of structural engineering, but also public policy that pertains to earthquake risk mitigation. Ryan, tell me, what would a Seismic Policy 2.0 look like to you?
Obviously, at the heart of it, we start to measure our performance not just in terms of safety, but in terms of how quickly we can return to function. So the concept of functional recovery is something we will adapt to. And we're going to talk about that for all sorts of occupancies, whether it's housing, whether it's commercial offices, whether it's retail spaces like grocery stores, schools, whatever it may be. We're going to look at it from a community services perspective and say, we need these sorts of services in this amount of time.
We spoke with Aaron Gross, the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Los Angeles, at the Great Shakeout press conference we held last October. Aaron spoke about how communities within a region and sectors within each community can build resilience by creating strong bonds of mutual support.
So resilience is really a community effort. We as a city, I as a city, the mayor as a city, can't do it all alone. It really takes partnerships, and resilience really builds on itself. When businesses are able to continue, then they're able to continue to pay taxes to the city, which go towards police and fire and emergency services and fixing the roads. And it really is important when we think about long-term resilience to think about the economic consequences of earthquakes and how that's going to affect not only individuals and families, but how it's going to affect businesses and city and society in general.
We can't speak about the interdependence of our communities without recognizing the need for inclusion. This means that it is essential we leave no one behind when it comes to advocating for resilience policy. In particular, we must consider our vulnerable populations who lack the resources themselves to recover quickly after a disaster, like an earthquake, hurricane, wildfire, or flood. These members of our community, as we have seen over the past year as we've dealt with the COVID pandemic, are vital elements of our workforce, on whom all of us rely to provide some of our most basic and necessary services. Consider how much more devastating to a community it would be if these essential workers, who will be relied upon after a major natural disaster, had no homes to go back to or buildings to work in. These first three INs help us realize that resilience is not something each of us can tackle on our own. It takes the recognition that resilience requires a whole of society approach to make sure that we understand what are the essential functions of a community that allow it to recover quickly after a natural hazard event. Also, how each function depends on and supports others, and how we must make sure that no one is left behind because everyone together makes a community stronger. The next three INs provide the foundation for putting in place policies and objectives that will improve the resilience of our communities and businesses. The first of these is inventories. Taking an inventory of vulnerable buildings is a key first step in understanding a community's exposure to risk. Many communities don't yet fully understand those risks. Amanda Syok runs the earthquake and tsunami programs for FEMA Region 10, which covers Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska.
In order to do a risk assessment for a jurisdiction, you have to look at what hazards you're vulnerable to, and then you overlay your seismic hazard map, for example. Then you want to look at what buildings are vulnerable. And you can also do a building inventory, which is where you're actually looking at, what year were these buildings built? Who occupies these buildings? Using an inventory can help identify what buildings could be more vulnerable based off of the year they were built or what their foundation type is.
Our next IN builds directly on the last, inspection. Inspection and engineering assessments of potentially vulnerable buildings, particularly older structures built before modern building codes were adopted. Engineering inspections help owners determine the extent of their risk and prioritize retrofit programs. Inspections can also help reduce or manage an owner's liability.
First rule of thumb is know your building, know your own building. You need to know if you have an older building, what type of construction that building was made with in its original, when it was originally constructed, and what changes and what improvements have been made over the course of time.
Information is the basis for business leaders, government officials, and the public to make good decisions and investments to protect organizations, communities, and families. Professional associations, elected officials, community organizations, media, and others play important roles in providing information on how best to withstand natural disasters. The key is to translate the science and engineering behind natural hazard risk into meaningful metrics that stakeholders and decision makers can use to raise awareness and support for resilience policy.
There is a disconnect right now from what the public understands and what, let's say, design teams are providing. We know, and this webinar series has certainly highlighted that many times, that there is that disconnect. And so as we did these public workshops as part of the FEMA NIST report and project, we recognized, and that's why some of the recommendations in the report are not just about how we design buildings, but half the recommendations about how we educate the public, how we help them understand the performance they should expect from their buildings. Functional recovery and community resilience is not just something that designers can solve. It's something that engineers, architects, and all the stakeholders really need to be communicating to the public and to the owners and users of these buildings to help them understand what to expect when the next earthquake hits.
The last four INs get at the meat of how to structure policy to accomplish the goal of making our communities more resilient in ways that are affordable and share the costs and benefits among all the stakeholders in the built environment. Let's start with one of my favorite INs, innovation. As a structural engineer for more than 30 years, I'm proud of all that the profession has accomplished in inventing new techniques and products to improve the performance of buildings, particularly in earthquakes, and make the goal of functional recovery possible and practical. In previous episodes, we've highlighted many of the engineering and industry leaders who have developed innovative products and analysis techniques.
There are a lot of good ideas and good practices that have been developed over the years that we rely on to get good performance from our buildings. We can use things like new technologies such as base isolation and passive dampers and implement those into our systems and our structures. And we have innovation in the way we analyze our buildings based on performance-based design, based on higher-end risk assessments, to be able to quantify performance no longer just in terms of how safe it is, but also how it's going to be behaving in terms of repair time and downtime and the costs that are associated with that.
Investment in high-performing new buildings and in retrofits of existing vulnerable buildings ultimately make our built environment safer and protects our economy. The National Institute of Building Sciences found that investments in better-than-code design or in hazard mitigation return between $3 and $13 for every dollar spent in terms of property and lives protected and the social and economic preservation of our communities. The good news is that thanks to the previous innovation, achieving resilient performance of our new and existing buildings is both practical and affordable.
We've shown affordable housing projects in downtown San Francisco can be built for higher seismic performance for zero increase in construction cost. We've shown how projects throughout the West Coast for schools, for other institutional facilities can be done for higher seismic performance for 1% or less increase in construction cost. Don't fall into the trap of thinking this higher performance comes with a big price tag.
Camilla Seth is the managing director of the Finance Hub, where her focus has been bringing the tools of commerce and finance in the capital markets to fund and drive environmental change. She described to me how lenders and large financial institutions are thinking more about how investments in resilience now help their own bottom lines when events like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and other disasters inevitably happen.
The thing that really changed the perspective of JP Morgan, possibly, was that they were having to swoop in over and over and over and over again. And the numbers of what the relief was costing were starting to become really significant and very hard to manage. And not just the dollars, but the level of effort from the business was becoming really significant. So there was a tipping point when the conversation went from being about relief to preparedness and resilience.
Investment leads us to the next incentives. As the NIB study I mentioned earlier shows, when an owner builds a more resilient building or retrofits a vulnerable structure, stakeholders across the spectrum benefit. Incentives make investments in seismic retrofit or higher performance more affordable for owners of existing buildings and developers of new construction. Incentives include tax credits, loan and grant programs. Incentives could also include expedited permitting, modifications of parking or other regulations.
It's really a basket of different solutions that come together to drive change. And incentives can come in many different forms, and depending on the individual and their situation, different types of incentives work for different people. Tax incentives can work. They can work for developers. Tax incentives can work individually through the IRS with things like disaster savings account.
Incentives was also top of mind for Lori Schumann. She's the Senior Program Director of National Initiatives and Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners.
So the leading tool for construction of affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit. And it has led to the creation of hundreds of thousands of housing units around the nation. And it's a critical tool that we use to make sure that housing is built and able to be developed.
Colin Diaz, the president and CEO of the Culver City Chamber of Commerce, talked with me about the perspective of the business community in his city.
So it would be important, and I think would behoove the city to work with property owners, to work with businesses and figure out those type of incentive programs, maybe some type of low interest loan that could be taken out to assist in that. I think if the city wanted to, They could look at pooling resources, diverting resources, and look at them from what that would save the city in cost.
In addition to private sector and community level incentives, there are an array of federal grant opportunities available to cities, counties, and tribal entities to support investment in resilient buildings, particularly the mitigation of existing hazards. Congress recently passed the Disaster Response and Recovery Act, which recognized that a lot more money needs to be spent on pre-disaster mitigation. Because if we wait until after the disaster, the cost of recovery will be so much greater. One of the programs established by the new law is BRIC.
So BRIC stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. The BRIC program is an evolution of FEMA's previous pre-disaster mitigation program, or PDM. FEMA did a ton of stakeholder engagement with communities to better understand what barriers they had to applying for and receiving mitigation grant funds. So the BRIC program took all of that feedback and tried to make the grant application and the grant process easier.
The last in we'll discuss is insurance. Insurance protects homeowners and commercial property owners from financial loss from earthquakes and other hazards. Insurance companies actually prefer to insure lower risk properties, and so have their own distinct incentives to help building owners invest in resilience.
Some examples of risk mitigation include physical improvements, such as reinforcement of the structure, so a seismic retrofit. It could be improving building systems, such as bracing sprinkler piping, and installing seismic gas shutoff valves on the natural gas supply lines to the building. It can also be earthquake response planning, especially a business occupancy resumption program, or known as a back to business program. So planning ahead, identifying how your building is going to be inspected following an earthquake and repaired promptly to get back in business as soon as possible.
And as Ben Stapleton of the USGBC-LA pointed out, insurers will benefit long-term when they provide guidance to builders and developers on how to create more resilient structures.
I think for resilience, there needs to be a discussion around, there's a tangible ROI for us to build a resilient asset versus a non-resilient asset. This is an asset that can better withstand earthquakes, that can better withstand the impacts of climate change, that is hardened in the face of fire. There should be financing benefits for that. There should be additional value in the price of that asset because it is better prepared to withstand those challenges and those potential costs and the risk associated with them.
The U.S. Resiliency Council has been actively working in the areas of insurance with brokers, underwriters, and the engineering community to achieve insurance incentives that reward resilience. As we've heard from our guests today, the subject of a new disaster resilience policy 2.0 involves every facet of the subject of resilience and how it affects every part of our community. With every new catastrophe, we are compelled to revisit what could have been done better and try to implement effective change. For better or worse, the need to adjust, adapt, and improve policy has become more urgent than ever. At the U.S. Resiliency Council, we're keeping it front and center, and we're building a coalition of partners to help us do so. With the support of our Resilience Advantage series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, we've made a lot of progress. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and that the 10 Ins of Resilience will help you, your communities, and your businesses chart a successful path toward a more resilient future. We encourage you to watch the previous episodes of the Resilience Advantage, and stay tuned for the upcoming installations in this series. And we hope that you will join us in this growing resilience movement. Thank you. Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I hope that it sparked in you hope and plans for ways that you can make your communities and your businesses more resilient. Of course, I always want to thank Compassion Unlimited for their amazing work in putting all this together. All of our interviewees. It's really a team effort, and thank you to everybody that was involved in that. Before we move on, I just want to remind you all that are viewing on YouTube that you can ask questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to fold in some of those with our panelists coming up. And you can also download our white papers. The U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic have developed a number of white papers on the economic benefits of earthquake resilient design and retrofits. And this really gets down to some more of the numbers about how you can make the economic case for resilient design and retrofit just being good business, pure and simple. So we hope you'll look at those. So at this point, before we move ahead with our panel, I do want to take an opportunity to, again, just sort of give a special thank you to my friend now, Ali Sahabi. Ali and I met several years ago and started talking about resilience and our mutual interest in that. And over the past, say, I think 4 or 5 years, I've really come to form a great collaboration together. I value Ali's real passion for the built environment generally, as a developer for many years, and as a leader in seismic retrofit in California, particularly of our vulnerable housing stock. I've really appreciated his insights and his help, but also all of the opportunities and doors that have been opened. Appreciate the introduction, of course, he has made to Treasurer Ma, and she has been incredibly valuable and supportive of our work. So, Ali, again, thank you so much. The USRC thanks you as a nonprofit organization working for the betterment of our communities in California and the country. So with that, I am going to bring on our panel. We are very excited to have several of the folks that you saw in the video today. Of course, Treasurer Ma joins us again, and we're so grateful to have her with us on the panel. And also Amanda Syok from FEMA, and I'm going to ask them all to sort of introduce themselves and give a little bit of their background. But Amanda joins us today, as does Ryan Kirsting, who you also saw in our video. And then we're very pleased, actually for the first time, I think, to have Ali Sahabi on our panel. So we're grateful for that as well. And again, feel free to start writing down questions, and we'll get fed those, and hopefully we can incorporate those. So let's kick things off by Treasurer Ma. I'd like to ask you to give a little bit more. You mentioned this a little bit in your opening comments about your background. You didn't just come into the leadership arena at the state level. You were heavily involved in San Francisco governance for many years and beyond at the state level. So maybe you can just give us a little bit of your background and why you've developed such an interest in seismic safety and policy.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I grew up in New York and moved to San Francisco right after undergrad, so at the age of 22. And that was my first experience in 1989 is with the Loma Prieta earthquake. And then it really struck a chord in me, the impacts, like you talked about in your resiliency video, that it's not just one city, it's the region, right? People saw on TV some of the impacts, the devastation, the houses that collapsed, the bridge that collapsed, and it created, panic. Relatives, friends were calling us trying to figure out, are we okay, right? So it's just not the immediate, but it does take, like you said, the whole society approach. So then when I got elected on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, I represented the Sunset District. And the Sunset District is the district closest to the ocean. All the homes are built on sand. They are all soft story. And when I got elected, there was an earthquake and rumors that if there was a big one, that the Sunset District would be the most heavily impacted. And that's when I jumped in and I said, oh my God, what are we going to do? We need a study similar to what these 9 local ordinance are doing is really requiring a study and then getting your building department to not only publish the study, but actually act on the study. And so San Francisco, I believe, is one of the leaders in trying to do mitigation and also funding a lot of these soft story retrofits. Then I asked to be on the California Earthquake Advisory Panel, understanding that that was an important body at the state. So I and about a dozen other individuals from around the state volunteered our time to provide input, as well as to listen and to learn. And now, as a voting member on the California Earthquake Authority, I actually have a little bit more authority in terms of policy and budgeting and priorities for not only our agency but the state of California. So that's kind of where I have come full circle back to earthquake mitigation, resiliency, and really welcome joining this growing resiliency movement with all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Treasurer Ma. We had on our series a couple months ago someone from the state treasurer's office in Oregon, and they were building a new treasury building. It's a base isolated structure. It's going to be a USRC platinum rated building. We're very pleased about that. But they gave us a feel for just how critical the role, the office of the treasurer and the treasury is, not just day to day, but after a major disaster. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what role your office plays every time there is a natural disaster, whether it's an earthquake or a wildfire or something else that affects the state.
Yeah, so I am your state banker, and so all of the revenues come into my office, about $2.5 trillion in a normal year. I also invest the state's idle funds, as well as invest for 22 local government units, and I issue all the bonds, general obligation, revenue, as well as the bonds for the state of California, the UC and the CSU systems. So one way that we help in emergencies is that we can allocate some of those idle funds to local community banks so that they can lend out immediately to the residents that live there that need that loan, extra assistance while they are dealing with whatever emergency situation. Also, by issuing bonds, I'm also in the center of many of these earthquake, retrofit processes that all the buildings are required. And so we all also, have a part in LEED, green buildings, especially now where there is an emphasis on ESG in terms of investments. And so impact investing is also one of our priorities at the Treasurer's Office, and making sure that we are issuing green bonds that are really green and doing what investors believe that they want to invest in. So earthquake, I think resiliency mitigation certainly is part of that mandate.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Treasurer Ma, for joining us. We also are really pleased to have Amanda Sayoc with us live and really representing the federal level. Boy, we have heard so much in the past several months about infrastructure and this federal mandate to build back better, and the words resilience are just coming around so much more at the federal level. So we're really pleased to have the federal perspective. So Amanda, welcome. Why don't you give a little introduction to yourself about what you do and what your responsibilities are?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Evan. I'm really happy to be a part of this, and I bring in the FEMA perspective. So my background, I work for FEMA Region 10, which covers Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And I help to manage our earthquake and tsunami programs. And what that means is I kind of help work with the geologists to understand the science of what can happen and where, and then work with the building officials to understand how do we build smarter and stronger for these types of potential disasters. and then working with state, local, tribal government to help them implement policies and codes to build for these active landscapes. And I do just want to point out, I am not a structural engineer. I'm actually an urban planner with a background in English and geology. And so I've just always been very interested in that nexus between the built environment and nature. And, just because we have built somewhere does not mean that geology isn't still actually happening. And in the Pacific Northwest, we always, we get happy when the mountain is out. So when we can see Rainier, when we can see Mount Baker, when we can see Mount Hood, and these mountains are created from the same process that is the Cascadia subduction zone, one of our largest earthquake threats in the region. So, trying to help people understand that, the reason the Pacific Northwest is so beautiful is directly linked to our earthquake risk.
That's great, Amanda. So let's follow up on that a little bit, and just from your perspective, from FEMA's perspective, what are some of the most pressing needs in the Pacific Northwest? We hear a lot about earthquakes being the California problem, that California is going to break away from the United States. So it's thought about as a California problem, but really there are a lot of pressing hazards in the Pacific Northwest. Maybe you can talk from FEMA perspective what you consider to be really pressing.
Yeah, so you're right. Earthquakes are very frequently framed as a California problem, and I think that's just because California has had more earthquakes in recent history, but Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska all have active earthquake faults. So Washington State, for example, we've talked about the Cascadia subduction zone, which is a giant fault that runs off the coast from Northern California all the way south of Washington, all the way through Oregon and into Northern California. That's a huge concern for earthquake hazards. But there are also other faults. There's a fault that runs underneath downtown Seattle. There's a fault that runs near Olympia. There's a fault in Portland. There's so many faults in Alaska. Idaho has its own faults. And as we were talking earlier about regional threats as well, Idaho is susceptible to shaking in Montana and Wyoming as well. So, earthquakes just happen on a different time scale than other hazards like flooding or wildfires happen. So, earthquakes are a huge concern in the Pacific Northwest, and it's not a matter of if they will happen, it's when. And it is really important that the Pacific Northwest catches up to speed where California is in terms of earthquake insurance and brace and bolt programs. We don't have that here. And so we're very behind the curve when it comes to building for earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. I was trying to craft some sort of joke around, it's not Idaho's fault that it has faults, but I love Idaho. I've been to Idaho. It's a beautiful place. But yes, it's another place where you don't necessarily think of the seismic risk. Even Montana, if you go further east, has a lot of seismic activity. It's more rare, but it can be big as well. So it's an issue in a lot of places in our country. I'd like to bring this down now to sort of the individual level and bring in Ali Sahabi. As I mentioned in my introduction, Ali is a developer. He's an owner and he's a contractor. And so he sees the impacts of seismic performance of buildings and resilience right down there at the level of somebody who's its business to build buildings, but also whose business it is to work with maybe a lot of mom and pop smaller owners and talking to them about resilience. So Ali, I'd like you to talk for a minute on for yourself, but also speaking to your colleagues who might be listening on this webinar, why resilience is important, why it should be important to developers and owners of properties in seismic areas, whether they're in Southern California or Idaho.
Thank you, Evan. Before I answer your question, I wanted to Thank you and your colleagues, Cheryl, and our production crew, your production crew, and some of my own team that have been contributing, Tom Robinson and Andrea Aguilar, for doing such a wonderful job this past 10 months, 11 months with this Resilience Advantage series. Thank you very much. I'm very proud of our sponsorship and being part of this movement, as our treasurer Ma mentioned. I also would like to thank all of our participants, including the ones that are here today, Amanda, Ryan, and certainly I want to especially thank our treasurer Ma, who has really shown amazing leadership and understanding of this very, very important natural hazard that we have in California, that we know it's coming, and we have an opportunity to do something about it. So for us, for me, it's been always I felt as a blessing that here is one of our constitutional leaders of the state of California who is paying close attention to what could be one of the most important hazards to state of California, and constantly thinking how to influence the outcome, that potential outcome a major seismic event can have. So thank you very much, Treasurer Ma, for being there for all of us here in California, and certainly for the subject of sustainability and resiliency. Evan, to answer your question, after being in the business of building and development and really trying to be in sustainability and resiliency for more than 33 years, as far as leading in that arena, one of the things that I came to the conclusion of really resiliency to the owners and to the builders, really, it shouldn't be anything but economics. Economics and return on investments. To me, one of the things that it's not about mandates, it's not about any other topic but economics. Why? Because we now know what are our vulnerabilities, what type of buildings are vulnerable. We now know how to fix them. And we now know that the economics works. The cost, as Ryan mentioned in the video, it's not going to be, it's a common sense. There are common sense solutions that can improve the likelihood of our existing buildings surviving a major event. So with that in mind, it's really informing and educating the public about the fact that there are solutions, and it's to your benefit. It's your self-interest, protecting your investments, protecting your employees as a business, who are the most important assets of a business, protecting your goodwill. If this is about a business, retrofitting of a business property, and your tenants, if you're a landlord, and understanding that this is a business decision, and making it part of the business planning process. We heard from one of the leading lawyers in this video, Madison Spock, who talked a little about the issue of liability in one of the past videos. Liability has been established Evan, at the appellate court, that owners in California of these buildings have a responsibility to deal with their buildings' vulnerabilities. So if they don't, there's a huge penalty to pay when things happen, when people are injured or die. And as you know, there is an established case on the appellate court. Just that alone, if we talk to businesses or property owners about that, if we inform them that you could be subject to losing all of your equity if you don't do something about this. So it's not just a matter of doing something necessarily to feel good about. It's really to protect your business, to protect your asset.
Thanks so much, Ali. We can talk about policies, we can talk about, all the amazing work that states and the federal government are doing, but when it really comes down to it, it's an individual decision. That's why we've been focusing so much in this series on ideas of incentives and how to make the business case, so that the decision can be made on its own merits as much as any kind of mandates. So let me bring Ryan Kirsting into the conversation. I've known Ryan for many years. I really appreciated his leadership in our statewide Structural Engineers Association. He's been a great partner in a lot of the advocacy efforts that the U.S. Resiliency Council has been working on. So Ryan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit more and give us some of your background.
Great, thanks Evan, and thanks to the USRC and Optimum Seismic for this Resilience Advantage webinar series. It's been fantastic. I'm a structural engineer here in California. I'm an associate principal with Buehler in Sacramento, where I am one of the lead experts on codes and standards, and I'm generally involved with projects that are seeking higher end performance or implementing a new technology, whether it's a structural analysis technique or a building structural system. I'm also co-chair of the SEOC Policy Committee, which is partly why I'm here today, and was one of the lead authors of the recently released FEMA NIST report to Congress on functional recovery and improving the post-earthquake performance of our communities in terms of the recovery time. I've been involved in SEOC for a number of years. SEOC has been around for 90-something years. It's been a well-respected and long-standing organization, heavily involved in the development of building codes and standards. But in the last 10 to 20 years in particular, we've really had a focus on transitioning not just from codes and standards, but to public policy. And so we've recognized there's a need for structural engineers to engage in the conversations of public policy surrounding, in particular, earthquake mitigation, earthquake risk reduction, but also how we design our buildings and how we communicate with our communities to help them understand what performance the building codes are giving them, and then listening to them to make sure we understand and hear the feedback from them on what building codes performance we should be expecting from our building codes for supporting community resilience. And I'm really happy to be here today to continue that conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. No, we appreciate your leadership. And you mentioned in the video, again, about this idea of functional recovery, but there's a lot of other things that, say, the Structural Engineers Association of California does to promote the value of structural engineers and good engineering design and codes. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the other initiatives that the engineering community's been focused on.
Yeah, great. In addition to the codes and standards work that we've been doing over the years, we really have been embracing the concept of functional recovery and community resilience. But that takes a lot of different looks. It looks at how we design our new buildings. It also looks at, and we focus on, how we help our local jurisdictions implement retrofit ordinances at the local level. We also advocate and work with state agencies to help us look at the building codes and make sure that a building code is getting the performance that we need. In particular, in looking how we can improve that functional recovery time by bringing our codes up to date with the expectations of our communities in terms of recovery, not just safety. We've also been very strong advocates of promoting the seismic safety and functionality of the state hospitals here in California, and the Hospital Seismic Safety Program is really important to SEOC and the structural engineering community, because again, we know that seismic safety is one thing, but for many essential services like hospitals, we also need them up and running quite quickly. And so that's been a very important part of our advocacy program. We also want to make sure that we're listening, like I said, and we're engaging at the community level to make sure we understand not just what's essential in terms of what our building code calls essential, but what's critical to recovery. In the pandemic, we heard of a lot more essential services types of structures or buildings or functions that our communities needed to be up and running. Right now, our building codes don't treat all those as essential. And so we need to be listening, and SEOC is on the forefront of that, listening to our communities to help understand what other services do we need quickly after an earthquake to maintain our way of life or quickly recover our way of life, not just make sure that we're all being safe.
Thanks, Ryan. And, I'll say the structural engineers, by and large, are a fairly low-key and humble group. But, having been involved in the community for more than 30 years, it's amazing how many hours of time structural engineers volunteer on committees for the things that Ryan mentioned, but also, just sort of it seemed like boring stuff to most people, but, how to modify little factors here or there in the code, or how to test components to make sure that, they're going to perform well in earthquakes. And literally it is tens and tens of thousands of hours per year that the structural engineering community donates to these efforts. And all of those things eventually go to making our community safer and more resilient. So this is a pitch to the structural engineers, for the structural engineers to know how engaged and involved our community is in working on these larger issues, even though a lot of it is in the back, doing the numbers and crunching the numbers. It's incredibly noble and valuable. So let's move on now to Treasurer Ma mentioned this in her remarks in the beginning, something called the Brace and Bolt program. It's really a great study of how the state, in coordination with the engineering community and sort of the financial agencies of the state and FEMA, can provide tangible incentives for homeowners to make their own buildings safer. So, Treasurer Ma, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the Brace and Bolt program, what it does, and why the incentives, or what the incentives are, and why they've been meaningful in raising demand.
A lot of times, people want to do certain things, but there are other priorities when it comes to household budgets. But if you can get reimbursed for doing something that could potentially save lives and save your building, then that kind of increases the probability that families or homeowners are going to do that. And so that's why this Brace and Bolt program is very, very popular. It is not open at this moment because we are waiting for the federal government to replenish our fund, so to speak. But a lot of times these retrofits cost less than $3,000. And so that is the maximum grant that we offer to homeowners who, to decide to hire a contractor that is approved by the Earthquake Authority to go and do the engineering study and then come out and actually do the retrofit. So you can't just go out and do it by yourself and submit an invoice, but it really is part of a program. So again, 16,000 grants have been awarded to date, and it usually takes 2 to 3 days for this retrofit to occur. So with that extra incentive of getting reimbursed, there really is not, I don't think, an excuse for people not to look into this and, stay in touch with our California Earthquake Authority website to see when that program is going to be replenished. But we will also do a lot of outreach to folks to let them know that now is the time.
One of the things that the U.S. Resiliency Council, the case that we've tried to make, is that resilience benefits everybody. So, obviously, if a homeowner, and we're going to talk a little bit about apartment complexes in a minute, but when a homeowner retrofits their home, it obviously benefits them. It preserves their property, their safety, but there's a benefit to the community as well. It preserves a tax base for the city and the county. It helps preserve the workforce, right? So a homeowner doesn't up and move to another part of the country. And it helps in terms of less disaster recovery costs that are needed by the state. So all of those things, I think, really fit in extremely well with this concept of the Earthquake Brace and Bolt program and the work that Treasurer Ma and the California Earthquake Authority have done to find and gather these incentives, because it's not a handout. It is something that benefits all of us. So we all can benefit when homeowners around the state, 16,000 of them to date, make their houses better. So let's we're going to get to let's go ahead and do this. Let's move on to a similar topic. We've talked about single family homes. Let's talk about apartment buildings. Okay, California, as we know, has an incredible housing crunch, right? Affordable housing is incredibly difficult. And in particular, apartment style buildings, it's difficult to build and keep them. But a lot of people don't know that there are probably close to 100,000 apartment buildings in California that are older construction that may not do well in earthquakes. They have what are called soft stories. So these might be 2 or 3 stories of living, or 1 or 2 stories of living above an open front parking area. So you just drive your car right in, there's no garage. And so that's open. And those buildings have been shown in the Northridge earthquake and Loma Prieta earthquake and others to not do well. So Treasurer Ma and Optimum Seismic, I'm very pleased, have been in a collaboration with the U.S. Resiliency Council for several months now to look at how we can address some of these types of housing issues for some of our most vulnerable populations. So again, I'll go back to Treasurer Ma and just ask, what is your interest? What is the state's interest in seeing some way to address these, apartments that could potentially house 2 to 2.5 million people in California?
Yeah, so through the Brace and Bolt system program, we see that homeowners actually take advantage of that. So what we have been working on with you, Evan and Ali, is trying to expand that program to multi-family affordable housing units. Up to 2.5 million residents could be living in those 100,000 buildings, multi-units, whether it's seniors, people with disabilities, students, low-income individuals, and they deserve to also have a sense of safety when they are in their homes in case and when the big one hits. And so that's what we've been working on. We proposed a $400 million budget ask so that we can expand it to allow property owners who manage or own these multi-family affordable housing units. We think that that is the greatest need that we need to focus on. However, someone mentioned inventory. I saw that in the chat. That was part of your 2.0. I think the question was for FEMA, if FEMA has this inventory, and we don't think, or we have not seen this extensive, detailed inventory of these 100,000 buildings. And so we are right now in discussion with one of the leading experts in data collection and geographic presentations. And hopefully they will partner with us on doing and collecting this inventory of buildings so that we can see where the hot spots are. And then we can talk to the elected officials who are in these areas, and we can get more people to advocate for more funding for these types of programs. And that's kind of been the missing elements in everything we talk about. Everybody knows it's coming. Everybody knows this is a problem, but we really don't know where. And that's what we're focused on. And hopefully we will roll out some exciting news in October next month.
Thank you, Treasurer. Well, then, good. It's a good opportunity to bring Amanda back into the conversation. Amanda, a lot of people think of FEMA as just an agency that comes in after a disaster, right? To clean up, to provide temporary housing. But there's so much more that FEMA does before disaster even hits. And one of the things you mentioned in the video, and as sort of a follow-up to Treasurer Ma's comments, is about grant programs, is about preventing the damage from occurring in the first place. You talked briefly about the BRIC program, and I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit more about what that is, who is eligible for it, what kinds of mitigation or planning activities it can address, and then specifically to Treasurer Ma's comment about inventories. You can't come up with a plan to fix something until you know what it is that needs fixing. So maybe whether or not there are opportunities through FEMA grant programs to do these inventories for a city or a tribal community to understand what its risks are. So that's a lot, but maybe you can kind of tackle that.
Yeah, happy to help tackle that question. So let's start with the grants. So you are 100% right. FEMA doesn't only show up after a disaster, but we actually invest a ton into trying to help prevent disasters from happening in the first place. So how do we plan for, how do we build for these natural hazards so that when they do happen, it isn't a disaster, it's just an inconvenience. So one of the things that FEMA does is we require state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to develop hazard mitigation plans, which is essentially a process for them to do an inventory of what hazards they are vulnerable to and what infrastructure, what people, what environmental infrastructure is vulnerable to these hazards, and then what are they going to do about them. So these are called hazard mitigation plans, and like I said, FEMA requires them to receive some types of grant funding, as well as FEMA also provides funding to develop these plans. So right now, FEMA has more money than it has ever had for hazard mitigation. So we have our BRIC plan, or sorry, a BRIC grant. BRIC stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, and like the seismic nerd in me always jokes that FEMA didn't talk to the earthquake people about this because we all know that bricks are bad. But in this instance, the BRIC grant, great. And we were given $1 billion, so $1 billion for this next cycle. The cycle applications open on September 30th. And this funding can be used for mitigation projects, capability and capacity building exercises, so like staff or building inventory or mitigation plans or stakeholder engagement, as well as management costs. So we all know that the actual act of developing grants and managing grants is very time consuming. So FEMA has developed this grant program that can help communities understand and plan for reducing their vulnerabilities. We also have a couple other grant programs. One is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and this is a post-disaster fund. But we were awarded because of the COVID disaster. There's $3.4 billion available for because of the COVID disaster. And that money all comes through the state. So I really encourage, if you are a local jurisdiction or a tribe, to reach out to the state to understand how you can access some of that hazard mitigation grant program money to develop building inventories, to do mitigation planning, or to even like start looking at, okay, we've understood that these buildings are vulnerable, like what's the next step? So, you know, I guess I wanted to add, you know, I think that looking at multifamily housing is so important for seismic. But I also want to say, you know, once you've identified the buildings that are vulnerable, it's really important to engage the occupants and users of those buildings as well. So building codes are so focused on the structure itself, and we need to think about the actual people that will be impacted by that building's performance. So I'm really excited to hear about the work that is being done in California, and I'm hoping that we can steal a lot of that work as best practice and implement it here in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, thanks, Amanda. You've given me a great follow-up on two topics, and I'm going to bring Ryan and Ali in on this as well. Ryan, from the structural engineer's perspective, this idea of inventories, but also what Amanda was starting to hint at in terms of inspection, understanding, okay, you've got this inventory now, how to make sense of it. So maybe you could talk from the structural engineer's perspective a little bit about this concept of inventories and understanding the risks that we face.
Yes, thanks, Evan. One of the things we talk about today is disaster policy 2.0. And I think the idea of inventories came about, I'll say it was part of 1.0, if not 1.1 or something like that, where we're really focused on structural systems. We've all heard about URM retrofits. We've heard a lot about soft story retrofits, non-ductile concrete and other programs. And so from a structural engineer's perspective, that makes all sense to us because those are safety-based, those are structural-based retrofits or inventories to work on. But as we've talked more about community resilience and some of the work we're doing at CEOC and with FEMA and others is really talking about changing that now in disaster policy 2.0 to be resilience-based inventory. So it's not just about the structural system or maybe a vulnerability, but it's about what role does that building play in the community in terms of the services it provides, in terms of the functions. And so helping to understand, as you do these inventories, to understand the uses of those buildings, not just the structural systems, that will help customize programs to your local jurisdiction. That will help prioritize funding maybe for some aspects of your community built environment that might need to be more quickly recoverable after an earthquake. And so it does kind of overlay onto what Amanda was just saying about not only the people in the buildings, but the community and what the community needs from those buildings too. And so having that resilience-based inventory concept is really something we've been working on from a structural engineer's perspective too, because there's a lot we can do from inspecting and knowing the type of structural systems that are there, but we really want to connect the dots to understanding how that building helps a community after the disaster.
That's a real excellent point, Ryan. I think we all are incredibly aware of how valuable grocery store employees have been to our survival during the pandemic, right? Essential workers they are, but the buildings in which they work are also essential. I mean, we come to think of hospitals obviously as an essential facility, but gosh, if we didn't have a local grocery store to go to get food during this pandemic, so we really have to rethink this idea of what is essential to our survival after a natural disaster. And it's going to be more than just the types of buildings that we normally think of as essential or critical facilities. So I'd like to ask Ali, you're the one on the ground here. You're in the field doing the work. Amanda, I really appreciated what she said about how it's not just a building, it's the people in the building. And they, whether they're an owner or really a tenant of the building, I mean, they're so impacted by this. And a lot of people think of seismic retrofit as, you got to gut the whole building and you got to move everybody out. And, it's an enormous disruption. I think what Treasurer Ma described with the earthquake brace and bolt program for single family homes, that it only takes 2 or 3 days to implement these things. That's probably an eye opener for people, that it can all be done while the homeowners are still cooking dinner in their house. So tell us from the perspective of multifamily apartments, what are both some of the challenges, but also the opportunities around the kind of work that needs to be done to make these folks safe and resilient?
Thank you, Evan. These multi-family soft story buildings are probably some of the most effective retrofitting projects. We know our solutions work to eliminate the risk to a very, very large extent. And so we know we can make these buildings safer. Then we also know through our experience with USRC this past a few months and with the support of Treasurer Ma that there is amazing support for an understanding of the importance of retrofitting these buildings. I don't think there are many other agendas, subjects that would have a diverse support of tenants, advocacy groups, environmentalists, business organizations, insurance companies, and financial institutions. All of these people on the same side to support this agenda. So that's really the opportunity that we can all agree. There are not, as I said, there are not too many things of special interest that you could have the apartment owner association and tenant advocacy group on the same side. They're usually on the opposite side. So that's the opportunity that we know with this agenda we can satisfy all of the society. So with that, why do the businesses care? Because many of the occupants of these buildings are the workforce. Why do the tenants care? Because they care about their own safety. They don't want to die under the rubble like people did in Northridge or Loma Prieta. And why do the bankers and insurance companies care? Because they have probably more equity in the building than even the owner does. In some cases, owner may have already paid off the building. And why do the owners care? Because that's what the equity they have. Many of the smaller buildings that California Earthquake Authority pilot program that is right now in front of FEMA for an approval. It's a pilot program that similar to the Brace and Bolt to give grants to property owners of multifamily property owners below 10 units. These are mom and pops. These are people that have worked hard decades, 30, 40 years to save up enough money to own these buildings for their retirement. And they don't want to lose that. So this is why the opportunity is, we have consensus. We just need to have leadership that we now have with Treasurer Ma to really bring some conclusion on some approaches, financial approaches that are equitable to protect these affordable housing. And another issue that we really discovered throughout this process is before COVID, the most pressing issue for the state of California was housing, affordability of housing, lack of enough housing inventory, and homelessness. This was what we all talked about. Being part of the board of Building Industry Association, I'm very well aware of that. So with that in mind, we need to think about this retrofitting of this multifamily. By default, these are our most affordable housing out there. So what we are doing, we are protecting these affordable housing units, which common sense, it's right now our average cost of retrofitting these buildings is about $5,000 to $10,000 a unit. And we know how much it costs on average to rebuild an affordable housing is $550,000. In Northern California, it's probably closer to $1 million. So it's common sense. 100,000 buildings times an average of 10 units per building, you can do the math. And so it does make sense. And this is exciting times with the federal government really prioritizing mitigation through FEMA. As Amanda mentioned, that's an amazing movement that really is very recent, within probably last 5 years, where we even have had some mitigation funding through federal government. So that's a huge advantage. And then on our state level, our treasurer Ma and others, California Earthquake Authority under her jurisdiction, really understanding this and coming up with a pilot program that is not funded yet. We're still they're still waiting for FEMA. For as of yesterday, we had updates that they don't have a final answer on their approval. So with that, I turn it back to you, Evan.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, the USRC has this sort of unofficial motto. We call it fear plus hope and a plan. We live in California or the Pacific Northwest or wherever we live that's in seismic hazard areas. We know there's a risk. We know the potential that faces us. But what you've seen, what you've heard today, what you've heard in the past episode is that there are solutions. Structural engineers and contractors and federal and state, leaders have solutions that are affordable, they're practical, there are ways to share the cost. It's just now a matter of implementing those. So the solutions are there to address these risks. We just have to have the will to do it. And Treasurer Ma reminded me that the state of California is already working very hard on seismically retrofitting its buildings. We're very pleased that the first state building to receive a USRC rating was the Clifford Allenby building in Sacramento, which we featured on a previous episode. That will be handling a lot of health and human services after a major disaster. And a project that Ryan and his company worked on, the Roseville City Hall Annex, Roseville being a city outside Sacramento, also achieved a USRC Platinum rating for a city, right? That knows the value and importance that building is going to serve to its community after a natural disaster. So with that, I'd like to just sort of end up by asking each of our panelists one more question, and that is about, again, coming back to this idea of Resilience Policy 2.0. So I'll start with Treasurer Ma. We've talked about funding for resilience measures, updating our building codes, functional recovery. But in your vision, what does a new policy around disaster resilience look like to you at the state level? What would you want to see a new vision for the state to be?
Well, obviously, more funding, like Ali talked about. That's always the key to kicking off any sort of initiative or policy goals. But also, the California earthquake early warning system. We have seen in these wildfires where people are now getting alerts on their smartphones, right, about evacuations or weather changes. And so I would encourage everyone to sign up for whatever alerts are available. And I know the California Office of Emergency Services does have this smartphone app that is linked to earthquake seismic early warning. Also, have a make sure you have an emergency plan. Like who are you going to call in case of an emergency? You also need to build a kit for emergencies. And I went to FEMA's website and they have a great checklist. You're supposed to prepare for an emergency for 72 hours in case you are going to be without power or without resources, access to your ATM or your iPhone or your computers. So you need to have food and water and other supplies. So that is very, very important. And then in October, Earthquake Preparedness Month, we practice our drop, cover, and hold on processes. I know the kids are all doing it in school, but we should also be practicing it at home or at work, because you just never know when an earthquake is going to happen. So there's a lot of things that are out there that we can be building on, that we should be expanding, and of course raising awareness. I think Ryan said it best, that there is a disconnect between the public and the people who are actually on the ground doing this business, engineering, contractors, FEMA. And so how do we educate the public that this is all of our concerns? Should be all of our priorities, and we all just need to prepare given where we live and the fact that it is going to happen. It's continuing to happen. We have earthquakes every single day, as I mentioned at the start. And so how do we better prepare and really prioritize this as a priority for California?
Thanks, Treasurer Ma. Thank you so much for joining us today. Amanda, I'm going to ask you the same question at a federal level. We have gotten a lot of very positive messages out of the federal government, out of the White House, FEMA. What do you think? Give us some insight, if you can, on how FEMA would like to see the next evolution of resilience, of preparing for and adapting to climate change, the inevitable occurrence of disasters. What would a Resilience 2.0 look like to FEMA from your perspective?
That is a great question. I think there's a few different things. So, I always come back to the hazard mitigation plan. And it's funny because I think that the value of that document is often overlooked. But there is no one size fits all approach. Every community is different. And, we know that we need to not only be considering all hazards and future conditions, so looking at climate change, looking at increased intensity and duration and frequency of disastrous events, and earthquakes fits in there too, in terms of future events that can and will happen. And I think that to what Fiona was saying about really linking the people as well in this conversation. So when you're looking at a hazard mitigation plan, there's historically been a huge disconnect in the field of resilience planning between community planners, so the ones determining land use and where things get built, but then between building officials, so how things are getting built and that permit process, and then emergency managers. And the hazard mitigation plan should be developed in partnership with planners, emergency managers, and building officials. And that just hasn't been done well in the past. But that plan, there's also a requirement for stakeholder engagement. And there's some great examples of how that's been done successfully. But there's a lot of folks that, they use this plan to check a box as like, we have to do this to get funding. And I think, especially with the amount of money going to FEMA's BRIC program, there is so much more opportunity for the public and for communities to get more involved in holistic community planning. What do we care about? What is essential? What do we need to plan for? And what are we going to do about it? And, as FEMA is kind of growing into this larger role because disasters are happening nonstop and our infrastructure is failing. It's a really exciting time for communities to really think about what they want to do. And FEMA is here with money. They just need to they need to apply for the funding, and that's all done through the state hazard mitigation officer. So I think that I've kind of even lost your question at this point, but in terms of what does FEMA want to see, we want to see communities asking for money to do large infrastructure projects so that all of these disasters that we know can happen turn into inconveniences rather than catastrophic losses.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. I just really appreciate your perspective, the perspective of the federal and state governments. I think Ali and Ryan have spoken very eloquently of what it takes on the ground to implement these policies. And we're so pleased to have the structural engineering community, the contracting and developer community that is really trying to be engaged and is just looking for the resources and support at the federal and state level. So with that, let me just again thank so much our panelists for today, our California State Treasurer Fiona Ma, Amanda Syok with FEMA, Ryan Kirsting with Buehler Engineering, and of course Ali Sahabi, the co-founder of Optimum Seismic and our series sponsor. Thank you so much to the audience too for asking some great questions. Thank you again to our promotional partners that have been essential in getting the word out, supporting the work that we do. And I hope all of you that are watching will encourage your colleagues to go to the USRC website and view this episode and past episodes. I hope you'll all consider registering for the next USRC or the next Resilience Advantage webinar on October 20th, and then our wrap-up to the series on November 17th. And I would be remiss if I did not put a plug in for membership to the USRC. We hope that you will support the good work that our nonprofit is doing, so that we can continue to bring you information and great speakers and panelists like we have. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.